Here is Sailor Studio 452, a nice mid-tone to dark tone purple with very slight blue lean. This blue is especially obvious in the chromatography and is the most resistant part of this complex ink. The swatch shows a golden sheen that isn't anywhere in the writing sample. There is almost no tone shift as papers change, and it can only be seen side by side. And it does shade very well. It does it on all papers. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs extremely well, as many studio inks have, in having no feathering, no aggression. This makes it a good ink for student note takers. The fairly consistent tone and nice shading has me really wanting a bottle. As a gift, but probably not to purchase a bottle for myself, it is that mid-tone zone after all.
The pen for today is a Visconti Van Gogh. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
A very nice mid-tone of purple with that slight blue lean, showing no feathering, no spread, shows some decent shading. Like if you look at objects on the first line, the E and the TS, the E is only slightly darker than the O, B, J, and the C. The TS at the end do get much darker. I think that's a little bit more. What you might expect more is what you see in might, where most of the word is a nice mid-tone, but the T at the end does get a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Manyo Shirakashi.
Here is Sailor Bungu Box Melancholic Gray.
Here is Sailor Studio 173. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
This is barely darker than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have some shading, even less than we had on the Clairfontaine, which wasn't a ton in the first place. But if you look at length on the first line, you can see that the H is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with ghosting. Nothing bleeds through to the page underneath. Only some of these dots get a little bit darker into the page, but I don't think that's going to stop you from writing back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get just about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. I feel like it's showing the blue undertone just a little bit more than it did on the Clairfontaine. I don't think this is being affected by the paper underneath. I believe we have a more opaque ink here. An opaque ink that does not feather, does not spread, does put itself in position to be able to shade a little bit. Look at position on the second line, where mostly we get a darker midtone with a very dark T right in the middle. You see the same thing with derangement on the first line, where you get a couple of darker letters like the G and the T or the D, but not the rest, which is really there as a nice, gentle amount of shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have some shading, less shading than we tend to see on the Clairfontaine, which wasn't a huge amount to begin with. If you look at lists as a word, it's a little bit darker than derangements on the second line. It's there. Derangements does show a tiny bit of shading within it, where the G is slightly darker. Same with that last E or the TS at the end. Most importantly, what we see is it stands out against this quad rule with no problem at all. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more violet or purple inks.
Here is Ancient Charm Grief on Jade Steps. Here is KWZ Berry.
Here is Noodler's Polar Purple.
Here is Platinum Violet.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is a little bit lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Lighter and flatter is what we normally get on this paper, so it's not a problem at all. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades probably the least of any paper. Though you can go find it, you might have to just make a short list of some of the spots you see it. Take a look at lists on the third line, where the list is a little bit lighter in tone than the TS at the end. It continues to stand out against the quad rule with no problem, making this a good ink for students. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Golden Oasis. Here is Diamine Graphite. Here is Pilot Mixable Pink.
Here is Vinta La Paz.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. We don't have a huge problem for feathering, but you can spot a couple of areas where feathering is occurring. Really, that was the first one that grabbed my eye. Then right here, there a couple little spots we can go find. It's not way out of control. It does have a normal amount of spread on copy paper. Generally, when I get the feathering with a normal amount of spread, it's not an ink that I go for something, but perhaps a drier, finer pen fixes the problem. The shading, it's there at the point where, again, the feather and spread occur together. I usually don't even care about the shading. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting. Nothing bleeds through to touch the page underneath, and we only have a few spots that it's getting deeper into the paper. I wouldn't write back here, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't write back here if you wanted to.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow, medium nib of the Visconti Van Gogh puts down a fun medium tone to dark tone of purple consistently, and it also shades consistently. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub, and the tone lightened and showed the blue much more, while it did shade even better. Now, I would say go for a medium flow, broad, or stub to really take advantage of the shading ability and still show the fantastic purple tone in the writing.